Good morning, everybody on the Pacific Coast, and good afternoon to everybody on the East Coast and Central Time. My name is Brian Staffa. I appreciate you guys joining me today. I'll get started right now because as an operator, I hate wasted time, so never going to waste any of yours. We're going to talk as in-depthly as I can because I've given this presentation now 4 or 5 different times. And most of the time I'm limited by 40 minutes, 45 minutes. So you'll see that I had to talk through this presentation like I was from New Jersey, like I am. And I've had to go through some things way too quickly. So I'm going to try to take a little bit more time today to really go through this in depth. And I also have the ability to answer questions on the fly rather than having to wait for you guys, wait until at the end. So if there's anything that I'm talking about on a particular slide and you want to ask some questions, drop them into the comments there. I have my partner in the same room off screen with me that's monitoring all the questions. So you'll hear her chime in and tell me that we have a question as they pop up, and I'll do my best to answer them as fully as I can. At the end of this presentation, there's also going to be a QR code. So if you're on your desktop, you'll be able to scan that QR code with your phone, and it'll actually take you to these slides. If for some reason you're on your phone, you can take a screenshot and scan it later, or you can just drop me a message on LinkedIn, and all my contact info will be at the end there. You can just shoot me a message. I'd be happy to send you the slides. So today we're going to be covering, as part of the cultivation series, all the questions that any decision maker should proactively ask to really plan for a successful cultivation operation. So we're going to go through a bunch of different questions here, and we'll get really into the meat of designing your operation in about 2 slides. But first, let's just pause for a second and ask, why ask yourself and why ask now? I looked over the attendee list, and a good majority of you are industry professionals that are probably actually going to be supporting clients through this process. And I believe that some of you are also prospective licensees. So I'm kind of going to do my best to speak to both. If you're a industry pro or a licensee here, a potential licensee, there's a couple of key points that I really want to stress here. As the business owner, or as your client being the business owner, it's really important to fully grasp all the questions that we're going to go through today so that we can effectively design our operation, which will then inform our facility design. How we design our operation is really built upon the business model and the financial model, the pro forma that you may have put together, whether with your accountant or just with other members of your team. All of the decisions that you've made to build this financial model and likely have raised some money built upon that financial model, they should be informing your operational design. And the operational design from there should influence your facility design. And if you take away nothing else from this entire presentation, it's to do things in that order: business model or business plan to operational design to facility design. What I'm hoping to help you or your clients avoid is what I've seen in so many different states where a facility is designed quickly so that we can get up and running and potentially try to become a first mover in the new market that you're in. And we often have to jam the operation into whatever facility was designed. And as markets saturate and as competition grows in each individual market, we have what's called price compression, where the price of wholesale flower and other products comes down, and the emphasis on your operating expenditures becomes really highlighted, where those that can produce at the lowest cost will be able to sustain themselves long-term in a profitable way. And ultimately, by designing your operation that's built on your business model to then design your facility will make it far more likely for you to be able to do this. So as the owner or as the lead on the project that's directing your client, there's a couple of mistakes I also want to help you avoid here. So often on the cultivation side, when I ask some of these questions, the owner or the investor will say, well, I'm not really too worried about that. I've hired a master grower, or I have my lead grower that's going to answer all of those questions. Most employees in most facilities are relatively siloed. And also, the master grower, which I'm not a big fan of that term, but let's just say, the director of cultivation, a very important role to be able to help answer some of these questions if you're relying on them. But the biggest thing that I've seen, or the pitfall, is that often that director of cultivation will stick around for a year, maybe two, before they move on to greener pastures, if you will, so that they leave a lot of things, when they leave the project, they may leave a lot of systematic designs or operational designs that the rest of your team may not be happy with. They also may not be congruent with your business model and really your ultimate exit strategy. You as the owner, or as that the industry professional leading your client, you want to be able to have them see the entire picture. Very few employees, if any, that you hire are going to see your entire picture. They're unlikely to answer directly to the investors that you've been able to take on. And if you can go through and understand all of the answers to these questions, you'll be able to better execute your business plan and ultimately be set up for long-term profitability and likely for that exit that you have in mind, whether it's 3, 5, 7, 10 years down the road, when you may have had 3 or 4 directors of cultivation throughout that period of time. So really, this helps you control your business plan, helps you execute on it more effectively, and it'll help you understand who you need to hire, how many you need to hire, what skill level they need, and everything that you'll see that we'll dive into. The last big piece here is that I've designed this presentation with indoor cultivation in mind. You'll see me ask several questions that might only pertain to indoor cultivation. That said, this will translate really well to greenhouse cultivation as well as outdoor. Most of the questions are going to be completely translatable. And also, if you happen to be designing a manufacturing facility or an extraction facility, a lot of these concepts and the way that I ask the questions should help inform a little, or at least a few of the questions that you need to be making for a manufacturing facility. All that to be said, we're going to focus, this first slide here is really going to give us the super high level of your business model and the business plan. And I plan to give an entire presentation on actually building a strong business model for cultivation, manufacturing, and the like. But ultimately, we need to answer the question of what is your market strategy for the flower that you grow? We want to have in mind what type of product that we're going to be creating and who we're going to be creating it for, because ultimately that's going to determine some of the decisions that we make here on the types of equipment, the types of staff, the level of automation, and so on. And you'll notice I have a couple of sub questions here that are really just a couple of the common market strategies for the flower, whether it be, what I hear most commonly is we're going to grow the absolute best, the top shelf. That's great. If there are a dozen other companies in your market trying to do the same, are you leaving yourself, fewer opportunities compared to what I consider, the dumbbell approach, which is, taken from other industries, which is what I call here the good, better, best model, where you're trying to category cover, where you have your value brand, your middle of the road brand, and then the top shelf brand, so that you can category cover anyone that might be coming into a dispensary where you have something from all the 3 different price points, effectively allowing you to sell the greatest amount of product through by way of volume. Whether you're planning to grow for extract only, or if you're just growing fresh frozen flower to be sent to create specific extracts, all of those are going to highly determine how we set this operation up. This leads to my next question, which are, what products are in demand in your market? Long gone are the days of 2015 or 2016, where I used to hear a joke that was, this is weed, it sells itself. Not in 2023 and beyond, does it? We have a lot of really really good operators, especially coming from all across the country. And now as we continue to expand into other international markets, many of them coming from the US with a lot of experience, we're seeing people focus on niches and really be able to specialize on different types of products. And you can't just decide to grow whatever grows and hope to sell it. Ideally, you're going to have a specific type of product and a specific market in mind. And ideally, the big takeaway I want you to have here is there are a lot of data resources available so that you can take from existing markets and apply them to yours. Even if you're in a market like, let's say you're preparing for Ohio or Delaware or Minnesota, 3 states that are legally adult use at this point, but don't have fully adult use regulated markets in them yet. I assure you that you can go on to websites or services like BDS Analytics, Headset.io, New Frontier Data, which runs Equio, or even Cannabis Media, just to name literally 4 right there. What their entire premise is to collect as much data as they can and bundle it to you in a easily digestible way so that you can then look at other markets that are as close as possible to yours, whether it be via demographic, population, or number of licenses. All of those different parameters will help you make a more informed decision on what products are selling in those markets, what products sell at the launch of a market versus what products are continuing to sell 5 years down the road. You can look at a Colorado, Oregon, or a Washington that have been legal for nearly a decade at this point. It'll be a decade on January 1st for a couple of those states. We have a tremendous amount of data with which to leverage. So if you take nothing away else from this slide, try to do some research on the data that is available so that you can make a more informed decision that will help set you up for a long-term profitable operation. Ultimately, what you start with in a market is unlikely to be what you're going to be selling and exactly how you're going to be selling it 5 years down the road. So prepare to be adaptable and be flexible. On this slide, we're really going to start talking about the infrastructure of your operation and your facility. So let's dive into the first 2 questions. Have you considered what type of data you want to collect and what you want to do with it? The second piece of that is the most important, what you want to do with it. We are in an information overload at this point where we can collect so much data, but if you don't know what to do with it, it's all just noise. So understanding if you're going to be using this data to optimize your individual harvests from batch to batch, whether you're going to be trying to simply identify anomalies, or if you're going to be trying to really rely on this data to make future decisions in states that you plan to expand upon, you're going to want to understand that as early as we can. And you see, I highly recommend having a BMS. For those that may not know, is a building management system. It's one of those pieces of software that kind of ties in all of the pieces of information coming from your facility into one spot to help you more easily digest that information. And I strongly encourage folks to look for a seed to sale tracking system that is very robust, a full ERP system. Do not solely rely on Metric, because Metric is meant to keep you regulatorily compliant. It's not really designed to give you actionable data with which to continue moving forward in your operation. And I asked this question very early on because if we can get these types of infrastructure systems in place early on, before the facility is even designed, your architect and GC can be able to put that into your facility now rather than later. And it's going to cost you about a quarter to a third as much if you decide to put all of these systems and all of these sensors in place before you're operational, rather than having to interrupt your operation to be able to add it later. Not to mention all the data that you're going to collect between now and the future time that you may consider adding it. You'd lose all that data and you wouldn't be able to action it or execute upon the data that you're receiving. Leading to the next question, which is how are you planning to monitor all your environmental conditions, such as room temperature, leaf temperature, humidity, light levels, and everything here, vapor pressure deficit? Most of the time, this is going to happen with a varying level of sensors in your grow rooms, in your interstitial spaces, and just in your dry rooms. Basically, every room should have some level of sensing capability in there. Depending on how specific you want to get and how much you're taking care of your sensors will determine how many you have. And really, the placement of them is incredibly important. Saw a great study that's still ongoing, I think it was last week, that showed that depending on exactly where you place just a temperature sensor, if you're in a shaded area or if you're directly under the light, you could have a 25 Fahrenheit degree difference from what the actual room temperature is versus what the temperature is that your sensor is feeding back to you. So making sure that you put those in the right placements, and of course, as more research is done, we're learning more and more where those placements are ideal. But if I can give you just one takeaway from this question here is overinvest in those sensors at the beginning. More is typically better so long as you have the software that can average the aggregate of them, but also help you determine where there are going to be microclimates in your facility, which you will also want to always be monitoring so that we don't have hot spots or cool spots in one area versus the other. Ultimately, all of these sensors will feed data back to whatever you're using to track that so that you can make a more informed decision from crop to crop on how best to move forward. Have you considered how much remote control you want to have within your facility itself? The Internet of Things and technology has made this really robust, where we can essentially, other than what we have to do physically to the plants themselves, we can operate a facility relatively remotely from end to end. And asking yourself how much of this you want to be able to do will add to your initial software setup and the hardware setup to be able to do that. There's two big pieces that I want to highlight here that aren't actually listed. We really need to focus on the security. Excuse me. We're not just talking about physical security and having guards and whether those guards should be armed and how many cameras we need to have placed. All that is vitally important, and I actually plan to be releasing an article that offers 6 to 10 different tips in the next week and a half, hopefully right before MJ Biz, that helps you understand how we can incorporate security design into your operation so as not to create bottlenecks. But what I'm speaking about here with this question is what type of cybersecurity are you going to have? Something that I've heard circulate through the security circles is that there are I call them hackers that are coming in and infiltrating cannabis facilities and essentially locking your DVR so that they are holding you hostage with a ransomware, because most intelligent hackers that are doing this understand to remain compliant from the state level, you need to be able to have your DVR recording at all times. And if you are not, you are now not in compliance. You run the risk of losing your license or at least having significant fines. So they really kind of have you in that position. Effectively working with your security team to develop the right level of cybersecurity so that if you have remote access, it is monitored appropriately and you have to go through the right firewalls and have the right number and type of policies in place regarding who can access them, where they can access them from. Just being able to allow your director of cultivation to monitor everything from their phone sounds great, and 3 or 4 years ago was a really helpful feature. At this point in time, with where we're at, sometimes that is a cautionary tale to maybe don't just automatically create that access. We want to have policies to who and when and where they will be able to access it to better monitor their job, but to be able to maintain the compliance that you need and the security of your facility and your operation. Lastly, if you have a good amount of remote access available, it enables you to hire fewer higher level people such as myself to be able to help support you in this endeavor. You'll be able to rely on outside consultants, or your C-suite may be able to be located remotely, because they can dive into most of the data and most of the controls that they need to from wherever they are, and come on site as needed. If you have no remote control, then everybody literally has to be at the facility to do what they need to. Last question is more of just an awareness creator, which is how important is environmental sustainability to you? As we continue to advance the conversation on lowering our carbon footprint, and in cannabis, especially in cannabis cultivation, carbon footprints are enormous. And understand that if you really want to market your product as carbon sensitive or eco-friendly, there are going to be quite a few different choices that we need to make from an equipment standpoint, from all the different fertilizers and substrates, all of the components that are going to come in to creating this product. We're going to need to make decisions based on that ethos that is environmental sustainability. I don't see that many companies doing it. And those that are relying on their packaging or their end unit that you're selling, and often relying on the bud tenders at the retail level themselves to educate folks on that. And I feel like the effort is there. It's well intentioned. Often I feel like it's missing the mark. So there is certainly an opportunity, if that is really important to you, to really drive that message through other avenues. Excuse me. We're going to really start diving into the operational design of your facility from this point forward. And this is where things really start to pick up. How are you planning to design your facility as it relates to room purpose? What I mean is, are you going to have individual rooms for every step in the process? Like having a dedicated propagation room, veg room, mother room. Maybe you're not going to go with mothers at all, and instead you're going to propagate via tissue culture. Are you planning to have multi-purpose rooms where plants can live their entire life in one room? Understanding that there are pros and cons to each answer, and then whether that's a yes or a no to each one of those sub-questions that I asked. What we're really starting to do here is starting to lay out the program of the facility itself. How many rooms do we need? What size are those rooms going to be? Where are they going to be located within the facility? And ultimately, a question we'll get to on the next slide will help us understand how long the plants are going to stay in each phase. Whether you've considered the number of grow rooms and the size in each of your facility is incredibly important, especially at this stage. Whether you make every room a standard size will really determine the complexity of your facility. And often, especially, let's say going back to 2012 to 2018, 2019, in most new markets, you were incentivized to buy a building that was less than desirable and had maybe been sitting on the market for the last 10, or in some cases, I've seen facilities that were sitting on the market for 90 years, were completely condemned, and essentially no one really should have ever gone back in there. But in order to win a license, to be able to curry favor with the town or the municipality that you were in, cannabis companies took over these less than ideal facilities and did their best to make something out of nothing. And in an ideal world, we're going to be building from the ground up, having a purpose-built facility. And in that regard, whether you're renovating a brownfield or developing a greenfield, you're going to want to standardize things as much as you can, because it's going to make your facility and your operation far more simple, far simpler for your team members and for your financial model. If you know every single one of your rooms houses exactly this number of plants or exactly this square footage of canopy, you can then, at least to as close as you can, apply a metric to that and determine how many grams per square foot, and then ultimately how many grams or how many pounds of flower you're going to be yielding from each room, and then ideally design all of your downstream operations from harvest, which would be your drying room, your trimming room, packaging, your storage vault, order fulfillment, literally everything else that happens after harvest. You're going to be able to design with a little bit more data in mind, and to be able to standardize each one of those rooms, because you know every set period of time you're going to be harvesting X number of pounds, and that biomass takes up this much space in the dry room. It takes up this much space in the cure room, and so on. If you have rooms that are many different sizes, it makes the downstream process a little bit more difficult, because you need to then build in variability of all those downstream processes. If you're going to be harvesting 50 pounds in one room and 130 pounds in another, that makes your labor very clunky and very peak and valley. And it makes it a little bit more difficult for employees on a day-to-day level to understand what they're going to be asked to do, rather than understanding that every 2 weeks we harvest 100 pounds. Well, then we have 2 weeks in the dry room to dry that. Then moving forward, we have 2 weeks to trim it, and so on and so on. As it relates to the number of grow rooms and the size of each one, ideally each step in the process is proportional to the next one, so that we can understand if we're going to have, one veg room supply 4 flower rooms, we can make sure that we have the right plant density and the right length of veg time to make sure that that one veg room can supply all of those flower rooms. But then that asks the question, if we're only going to have one room in any one of these steps in the process, what do we do if there's a catastrophic failure in one of those rooms? What type of redundancy do we have? And in an ideal world, we like to have at least some level of redundancy in the event that there is some type of catastrophe. We want to make sure that we're covered, because this crop is so valuable. And if we have a challenge with our supply chain where we stock out of our product, one of your competitors is waiting to step in to fulfill that shelf space. And ultimately, once you have that shelf space, you truly never want to give it up. Last piece to this is, or just two more pieces, which are, if you understand what size your rooms are and what's going to be going on in them, you can then make sure that you're allowing for all of your appropriate walkways, your employee movement, and ultimately your ventilation. So often I've seen people make the mistake of taking a room and just cramming as much canopy in there as possible, which makes the equipment that you have to run all of your temperature and your humidity, it adds tremendous stress on them, because they need, in a lot of rooms, the mechanical engineer that I really like to work with often suggests that we have 18 inches or more headspace at the top of the room, as well as space around the sides of the building or sides of the room and the canopy, so that we can have adequate airflow and we're not just trying to force everything through a really tight canopy. Not to mention, your employees' day-to-day lives are quite miserable if they don't have room to work, and ultimately your crop quality will suffer if your employees are miserable and they don't want to be working in that space. Lastly, I touched on this a little bit as far as understanding your biomass and how often it's going to come down and in what periodic rate. This will really make it a little bit easier to understand if your business model is going to be executed upon. If your financial model dictates that you need to be able to produce, let's call it 12,000 pounds a year, well, then if we dial that back, that's 1,000 pounds a month, and we'll be able to determine through our room size, through the yield that we're expecting, are we going to be able to execute upon that? And literally at this stage, we'll be able to start doing some checks on whether our business model is going to be able to be executed upon. From here, let's see, what style of grow do you plan to operate? And style, there's a depth of detail that I can go into here, but what I'm really specifically referring to is how big are the plants, how big, how tall, how wide. Uh, if you're trying to grow what I would call trees, plants that are larger than 4 foot tall, that's going to really inform whether even growing with a multi-tier racking system, whether that's even feasible or really cost effective. It'll the style of grow that you run and that you would like to uh, execute on here will ultimately depend on the end product that you're trying to create. For example, if you're trying to grow top shelf buds, where you're trying to be literally the best in your market, I'd recommend against going with a true sea of green, which is keeping plants very little to no veg, keeping them less than 15, 16 inches tall, and making them just grow with a single cola. Because ultimately, plants that are that young, only growing with a single cola, are only going to grow buds of a certain size. And when you're talking to connoisseurs, they want to see that big fat bud that they can brag to all their friends and on social media that they've got the biggest, dankest nug, if you will. And if you're trying to grow for that, you're going to have to adopt a style that's not just propagation to bloom. You might want to adopt something else in between here. That's just one example, but the other big piece, your decision here is going to really affect your employees' workload. The larger the plants are, the more cumbersome they are to work with, and the more difficult it is for them to maintain pest pressure, because ultimately the larger the plant, the older the plant, and the more likely they are to come in contact with some level of contamination, whether it's a virus like the hop latent viroid, or some sort of pest pressure, whether it be aphids or spider mites, what have you. The other big piece is we're going to design your infrastructure of your facility, your benching, your irrigation, the dry room itself. Many different components are going to be designed from the style of grow that you're going to have. I take this, compare this to food manufacturing, where if you're a chicken grower or a chicken processor, as just one example, they grow one very specific breed, a boiler chicken, that is going to be born on this date, and literally 41 to 42 days later, similar timeline as cannabis here, they're going to be harvested and brought to the processor. And those chickens are going to be nearly identical in size, because all of the machinery that's going to process those chickens is meant for this exact size chicken. And so if you can take that visual and apply it to cannabis plants, we're trying to do much the same thing, so that we know if we're growing plants that are going to be roughly 2 foot tall, they're going to have roughly 16 buds per plant. We know how we're going to break those down to hang them to dry and process them later on in the process. Again, we're trying to standardize it and make as many things as thoughtless as possible, so that things just flow. The more flow that we can create, the fewer errors are going to happen, the higher quality control we're going to have, and it's going to be easier to monitor that quality control, because if we can spot an anomaly, we know that that plant's supposed to be this height, but it's that height, or it's this height. We can determine, hey, there's something wrong here. We better look into that. Taking a step further, what's your intended life cycle for each stage? Remember on that last slide I had talked, are we going to have dedicated spaces and dedicated rooms for each step in the process? That's my preferred method to do it. And if so, how many days will plants stay in each room and stay in each stage? This really affects your operational flow, like I had mentioned on that last question. And if we're trying to maximally produce, we want to make it so that your propagation leads immediately into veg. We veg for a certain length of time, and from there we immediately go into flower, so that we have each room maximally effective. I see a lot of facilities that I try to improve upon, where they're doing what I call they're growing the floor, or they're growing the table, where we've got space that is not canopy, that they're shining light on and cooling and heating and all that, which to me I just see as tremendous waste. And if you have a flower room that doesn't have plants in it for 1 day per cycle, if you're trying to get a six harvest per year business plan, if we're not flowering for 1 day or 2 days in between, we're 6 to 12 days of lost potential revenue. And when I really look at things, I'm trying to see how many milligrams of THC or cannabinoid, or how many grams of flower are we putting on every single day, not just every harvest, every single day. And so if we know the intended life cycle for each stage of the plant, we can then determine how many rooms, what size those rooms have to be, and most importantly, what the proportion of one room to another is. Let's just give one tiny example. And I also I have a very short video that I'll probably expand upon, that's posted to my LinkedIn and to my resource lab on my website, that answers the question, what's the ideal number of grow rooms? I encourage you to look that up, but the answer, quite in a concise way, is you want a number of grow rooms that is a multiple of the number of weeks that you're planning to flower, which we'll get into in deep in the next question. But basically, let's just say we're going to be flowering for 8 weeks, a standard of 8 weeks in every single room. I would want to have either 2, 4, 8, maybe 16 flower rooms, some multiple or proportion of 8, so that I can make all of my processes, both upstream and downstream, as simplified as possible. Watch that video. I go into a little bit more detail, and I want to keep moving for everyone's sake today. But ultimately, if I've got, let's call it 4 flower rooms, and I want to be able to have one veg room supply all of those flower rooms, I can say, let's say I have 1,000 square feet of canopy in each one of those flower rooms. I could quite literally take 1,000 square feet of veg room and use that to supply each one of my flower rooms. How would I do that? Again, we're going to be flowering for 8 weeks. We're going to veg for 2 weeks, and I'm going to double the density in veg to, let's call it 2 plants per square foot. Let's just say, for easy numbers, I'm going to flower at 1 plant per square foot. And since I have my veg plants are going to be in there for 2 weeks at a time, I can stagger that production calendar so that the first plants that went in are going to be ready to be moved to flower in 2 weeks. They'll go into flower room 1. 2 weeks later, I'm going to be able to have another crop ready to go into flower room 2, and so on, so that in an 8-week period, I've had 4 cycles of plants rotate through that veg room to supply each one. And by the time I'm ready to harvest that first flower room, I've got plants that are ready to move directly from veg into flower, so that I lose literally 0 days between each crop and each harvest. I'll get a little bit more into that process in another slide or two. So let's just kind of talk about our flower room strategy. You've heard me talk about standardization a lot. I really, really appreciate standards. It really makes for a more stable business model, makes for more stable revenue, and it makes life more predictable for both your employees and for your investors, which is truly why I try to push towards as much standardization as possible. It eliminates as much waste as we can too. Are you planning to standardize all of your flower rooms to flower for the same length of time? You don't have to. There isn't a right or wrong answer here, though I would push you to the standard. If you say, no, we're not going to be standard. We're going to have certain rooms that flower for this length of time. We're going to have other rooms that flower for this length of time. The reason that you might do that is so that you could have a greater genetic variability in your entire facility. For example, you want to be able to grow really rare exotic sativa strains that flower for 90 days. You also want to grow some really indica dominant strains that flower in 55 days. You can have a greater product variability if you do that. It's just going to make your operation a little bit more complex to plan, and you're going to need a higher level of skill in your director level and your assistant director level to be able to execute on that, so that there are no bottlenecks and so that everything flows properly. It can be done. Just want to kind of inform that it'll just be a little bit more complex. If you're planning to, right now the industry standard, depending on who you ask, is flowering for 56 to 60 or 63 days. And so people like me will say have 4 or 8 flower rooms because we're going to be flowering for 8 weeks. Other people will say have 6 or 9 flower rooms because we're going to be flowering for 9 weeks. Again, it's more of a decision on how many harvests you want to have per year. And ultimately, what I do is I design the operation and I genetically select cultivars to fit that operation. I do not recommend cutting plants early or cutting plants late to fit with your schedule. Rather, select the genetics that will fit with the plan that you want. And if you stick with a 9-day turn or a 9-week turn, you may have a greater availability of genetics with which to select from. And ultimately, all of these questions are going to how many rooms, how big those rooms are, and what your week-to-week, day-to-day workload is for all of your employees. Have you considered if and how you're going to transplant? This may seem somewhat comical, but there are often facilities that I see where this entire process, which may happen once, may happen up to 3 times in a plant's life cycle, depending on exactly how you design your operation. This was an afterthought. And so it may be happening on the loading dock of your facility. That is far less than ideal. And in this one facility I have in mind, loading dock was down at one end of the facility, and the flower rooms were either literally an entire story above them or about 300 feet down this very long corridor to be able to get to them. And as you can imagine, employees that are hand potting cocoa in one area of a facility and then trucking it or carting it, or even using a conveyor would have been better. But moving those hundreds of feet and an additional story, having to use an elevator, creates a tremendous amount of motion waste for your employees. That is quite literally not necessary if we factor this piece of the operation in before we design the facility. And so whether or not you transplant, I'm not going to say yes or no, but if you're going to, consider how you're going to do it and where you're going to do it in the process. Let's take an example of transplanting from propagation to veg and then from veg to flower. Transplanting from propagation to veg usually doesn't take that much space comparatively to going from veg to flower. But if you're going to be up potting and going from, let's say, a half a gallon pot to a 3-gallon pot from veg to flower, that's going to take a tremendous amount of plant media, depending on which one you're using. And ultimately, if you're going to be using a potting machine or if you're going to be using manual labor, you're going to want to place that room somewhat in flow so that you don't have to create as much motion waste, as much time waste, as much energy waste in your employees, making their lives a little bit easier. They'll be able to focus on their quality control significantly more if they're not getting burnt out by the end of a day because they have literally put in 7 miles. I know that you guys are likely familiar with all the stories that you heard from Amazon workers in their fulfillment facilities. This is going back a couple of years, where some people would be doing 12 to 15 miles of walking a day. They've now altered that by using a lot of robotics. But if we can kind of build our transplant station into the flow of the operation, because our veg room is located here, all the flower rooms are here, and here, we can put transplant, somewhat in flow there so that we don't have so much waste happening. Another way to streamline that is instead of going with pots and up potting, what I'm seeing in a lot of facilities now is going with compressed cocoa or rock wool, where we start with a block that is this size. We flower in a block that is call it 3x that size, and instead of having to literally go and transplant, we set our destination media on the actual tables themselves in the flower room, and we come and we literally plop a veg plant onto that once it's been hydrated appropriately, which it essentially eliminates a transplant step and saves a lot of time and saves a lot of labor. So just understand what you're going to be doing so that we can design that piece into the facility. Next is your harvest strategy. Really what I'm referring to is, are you going to harvest your entire room at once, or are you going to be doing a split harvest? Which in a future question, it'll ask, how many cultivars or strains, I use that interchangeably. I use that term interchangeably, excuse me. If you're going to be having certain strains that are harvested at 8 weeks and others that are going to be harvested at 10 weeks, if you're going to grow those in the same room, how are you going to be harvesting them? Are you going to harvest half the room at one time, come back later, and then harvest the additional room? Understanding that for 2 weeks or so, you're growing the floor in half your room. Understanding that if you're going to keep everything flowing as effectively and efficiently as possible, my suggestion would be that you harvest each room in its entirety so that you can then clean that room, sanitize it, and then replant it. But just understand that what this is going to do, this is going to affect your workload. It's going to affect the complexity of the operation. It could affect your pest management strategy, because if you're having a lot of labor come in and harvest half the room and then leave the other half in there, you're potentially opening up that remaining half into a more contamination risk that you may just want to be aware of, and maybe you consider altering your strategy as it relates to that. It'll also affect your downstream processes as well, like your drying strategy, your trimming, and so on, because you're only taking biomass from half the room. So just understand that this specific decision will have very large ramifications, so just plan accordingly. This brings me to the drying strategy. Have you considered your drying strategy? And it's not that we're going to dry. Yeah, I would hope so. Most facilities do, unless you're going to be pushing toward fresh frozen for specific types of extracts. What I'm referring to is, are you going to hang dry, tray dry, freeze dry, or use an industrial dryer? All of this is going to greatly determine what your end product is going to be. So going back to that very first question, if you told me that you want to grow for the top shelf, do not use an industrial dryer to dry your plants, because what that is things like a lumber dryer or something like that. There are some very large MSOs that use these so that they can harvest on a Monday, dry it on a Tuesday, and literally package it and have it on the shelf Wednesday or Thursday of that same week. That's going to be a very low perceived quality product. Will it have the cannabinoid? Sure. It will have nearly no terpenes. And for anybody that wants a quality product, it's not going to be there. Conversely, or in a similar way, tray drying, which would be using different style baker's racks or different HDPE trays to that you can stack. It makes the drying process much more space effective, but it also creates flat spots on the buds. And again, if you're going to want to grow for that connoisseur, if they take their bud that they paid top dollar for, and they see that there's a big flat spot on the bottom, that's really going to turn them off to your brand, and brand equity, and really driving the emotional experience of that connoisseur is really important, especially when you're at that top shelf. So you wouldn't want to tray dry if that's your intended goal. These decisions will affect, again, your final product, the ultimate perceived quality of it, as well as the space and infrastructure of your dry room, not just, how many racks do we need to have and how are we going to hang them, but it'll also affect your HVAC strategy to help your mechanical engineer determine how much airflow do we need, where do we need that airflow, and ultimately how much space in totality and how much volume of air do we need to execute the drying of that biomass. Excuse me. Let's talk about the trimming strategy, because this is really, we're kind of going downstream. We talked about the flowering, we talked about harvest. Now we're talking about, we talked about drying, and now trimming. In most facilities and in most operations, we're going to trim after it's dry. But that doesn't mean you have to do it that way. So then, ask yourself, are you going to dry trim, wet trim, or are we not going to trim at all? In cases of pushing product to extract, many of the times they don't trim at all because there's no reason to really invest the labor or invest in the equipment to do so if we're truly just growing cannabinoid at that point. We're not really growing bud or flower. We're literally growing cannabinoid because it's going to go all just jammed through some form of an extract anyway. Understanding what this is going to really impact is your labor and how lumpy or how stable that labor is. Again, if we started with a very standardized size room, we know that we're going to be taking down a relatively standard volume of biomass every set number of days. We now know that the dry room has to be a certain size. And we also know that we need to trim through, let's call it that 100 pounds. We need to trim through 100 pounds per week. This will help us size the equipment if you want to be trimming using some level of automation. A lot of the times people will do a mixture of some automation and some hand trimming. They want to use that marketability of saying that it was hand trimmed and maybe want a little bit higher quality than some perceive automated trimmers can provide. This will help us size the equipment, the number of machines that we need, ultimately then size the dry room because we need to fit, the trim room. We need to fit all of that equipment in. We need to make sure it has the right power, the right ventilation, and so on. But let's just say we're going to be dry trimming, and we want to do everything by hand. The number of employees that we're going to need to execute on that model is far greater than if we incorporated some or all automation. And so we're going to have to design the actual room itself to accommodate that number of employees, that number of stations. And we're going to also want to have the right level of security in those rooms because that's where so much product is handled in a tremendous volume, which is where we often will unfortunately see a good amount of leakage coming because it's easier at that point than at any other point in the process. So we'll want to design the security system effectively around where these stations are actually going to be. So as an example, we can have an overhead camera on each individual trimming station where we're going to be hand trimming. All of that's going to inform your labor load and the skill level of that labor. The more automation that we're going to have, the greater skill level we're going to demand. Have you considered how you're going to clean and sanitize your rooms and how often? Rooms like your trim and packaging room, in my opinion, they should be cleaned literally after every shift so that we can keep them as sanitary as possible. A dry room, again, in my opinion, should be cleaned extensively after every crop. So once you break that dry room down and send it to trim, that dry room should be cleaned and sanitized. And going back to your flower rooms and your veg rooms, in an ideal world, you're harvesting your entire room at one time so that you can then clean your room before you add an additional crop to it. So I teased this before, but here's how my ultimate operational flow would go, where we have veg feeding flower, and all of that is very highly standard, so that when we have a harvest day in facilities I operate will nearly be on the same day every single week because everything is flowing in perfect unison. Let's just say on Thursday is harvest day. I'll have the harvest team start at, call it 8 a.m. And by 10 a.m., they're going to be a certain portion of the way through harvesting that room. At 10 or 11 a.m., 2 or 3 hours later, I'll have a cleaning crew come in behind them so that they can start cleaning all of the surfaces that have been harvested already, getting rid of the plant media, getting rid of any of the foliage that has fallen on the ground, and literally starting to scrub and clean all of those surfaces so that by the time the end of the day rolls around, if you've staffed properly and your flow is going well, by the end of that shift, you're going to have your entire room finished being harvested, and it's going to be now sitting in the dry room after it goes through all of its compliance weighing and tagging and so on. Your cleaning crew will come right behind them so that you have, by the 2 or 3 hours after that room has been fully harvested, that room is completely cleaned. And depending on what market and depending on exactly what types of products you're going to use to sanitize your room, often will rely on some aerosols, such as a ProCure, as an example. And a lot of these products have a reentry period to them that might be 4 hours, it may be 8 hours, but ultimately, we want to keep that window as tight as we can so that by the end of the first shift on a Thursday, we have the team putting on that ProCure bomb and releasing all that gas into that room. We have that reentry period of 8 hours so that everybody goes home on Thursday. They come back on Friday. The reentry period has ended. We can come in and clean all of that material one last time. And by 8 or 9 a.m. on Friday, we have plants moving from veg into flower so that that flower room never sits empty more than, call it, 12 hours from harvest to new crop. That's one way to maximize your production flow in your flower room and to make sure that every single surface in every room is clean as often as possible so that we can limit the contamination from crop to crop and minimize pest pressure since we're growing in an indoor or in a greenhouse environment. Moving forward, let's talk about remediation. Are you expecting to proactively remediate your finished product before releasing it to market? This one's a little bit controversial. And really what I'm referring to here is exposing your flower to one of the 3 options that you see to the right, which would be radio frequency, ozone, or some sort of X-ray, where what you're trying to do is expose your product to one of these components to kill any type of microbials, any bacteria, any pests that might still be there, with your end goal being to eliminate the risk of failing any type of compliance testing or quality control testing. Some states are a little bit more strict than others. Some states allow proactive remediation, others don't. So understand what your market allows and also understand what your customer would desire. The main reason for doing this is to save time, a tremendous amount of time, and save costs. If you have to test your product and wait for the compliance testing to come back, which is usually 72 hours, if you are now waiting and you have that kind of built into your operational flow, great. And once you have your passing test result, it can continue on downstream and everybody's happy. However, if you have some sort of failure come in where you have to then submit it for retesting, you're now going to delay yourself an additional 3, maybe 4 days, because once you get your results 72 hours later, you see that you've had a failure. You have to call the lab back to come back out, which they may not be able to come out that day, but then basically submit another sample to try to retest and hope that you pass at that point, or remediate and then submit that retesting. So you can see that there's a lot of additional time, whether it's 4 days, could be 6 or 7 days, where you're delaying that biomass to get to the end product. Do you want to proactively do that ahead of time? And if so, how are you going to do that? If you choose to go that route, you may want to have an additional room that is assigned specifically for this purpose and for this process, especially if you're going to be using an X-ray machine where you have to build the facility in such a way that it is protected from that radiation. But understand that this is becoming a bigger conversation to have as testing becomes stricter for consumer and patient safety from state to state and country to country. You may want to consider this as part of that process. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the end consumer may have a perception on companies and brands that do this proactive remediation if they know that you are doing it. For those of you that do remember this piece, or this time of culture where we would have irradiated meats, and I think it's the USDA regulated that you have to put a sticker on that product that says that this product was irradiated. If you're sitting there in a freezer, at the grocery store, and you see this meat was irradiated, this one wasn't, certain customers are going to gravitate towards the one that wasn't. Others might gravitate towards the one that is. And ultimately, I'm not here to say one is better than the other. I'm here to really inform and create that awareness that this is now a thing. And you want to make an informed decision as to what's right for you, your business, what's right for your end consumer, and the product that you're trying to create. We have a couple more slides, and really this one, a lot of these slides that I've talked to up until this point have mentioned this. What is our staff's weekly workload? This is really important because it's going to help you decide the number of employees you need, when you really need them, and the level of skill you're going to need to hire for. Like I had mentioned before, the greater level of standardization that you have, the more predictable all of these processes are, so that you can know that we're cloning every 2 weeks. We're transplanting every week, let's just say. Pruning and harvesting are a little different and will depend on your operational design as it relates to the size of the plants and what type of product you're trying to create. And that last question there of how quickly are you turning around a room after harvest, I just touched on that in that last slide. You heard me mention that I have the harvest team and then I have the cleaning team. Well, I require additional staff for that. And since there's, cleaning doesn't happen every single day in every single room, what I'll likely do is repurpose some team members from other areas in the facility to be that cleaning crew. But understanding how often you're doing all of these major tasks will help inform how repeatable all of these processes are. And what we're trying to do is really simplify employees' lives. They know, as an example, they might know every single Thursday is harvest, every single Friday is replant, and every single Monday, as an example, is cutting clones. This makes things much easier for scheduling, and it makes it so that people can train to be able to better manage one another, to a point that at a certain point, when you have an experienced team that has been working together for 6 months, there's very little margin of error. They come in, they know exactly what to do, when to do it, because they've already repeated this process 14 times. Have you considered the last piece to that? One of the biggest challenges a lot of non-standardized cultivation facilities run into is that their labor is very lumpy. What I mean by that is, they during harvest and during trimming, they require a tremendous amount of labor because they haven't standardized things, and they will then rely often on temporary labor, which is a whole subset conversation that I won't really get into here. But having very peak and valley labor loads makes your costs very peak and valley, and also requires you to schedule really complex processes and procedures that you're relying on a huge number of staff. Your security risk really elevates, and if you can really try to make that labor not as peak, not as valley, it will just streamline everything from your costs to your revenue and your security risk a hell of a lot more easily. So if you can standardize that weekly workload, you'll be better off with all of those pieces. Have you considered the number of staff you intend to dedicate to each step in the process, and then really what are these numbers based on? The answer to this question, I did a full-length deep dive with examples, both on LinkedIn and on my website in the resource lab, that tries to give an example of how many employees a successful cultivation operation would need to be effective. And this is going to depend on literally every question that we've asked up until this point. And really the other bigger question is, how are you going to structure your staff? For example, are you going to have staff that lives in the flower rooms, or maybe specific flower rooms where they are responsible for that room or those 2 rooms only? Are you going to mix staff? There's pros and cons to each. If you're going to have staff that are solely accountable for one or two rooms, often there will be a tremendous amount of pride in those rooms. And there may be a high level of quality control comparative to having, shared responsibility among many different rooms. There's a lot of different ways to manage your QC here. But if you have people that are, the con to that is if people are solely focused on one part of the process, often they get so siloed that they're only focused on their piece, and there's less concern about upstream or downstream. They only care about their piece, and often employees will get bored and not really have as much momentum or excitement for the job if it becomes way too robotic, and they live in the mother room taking clones every few days and taking care of the mothers. They may burn out on that a little bit more quickly than if there is variability. It may be more simple to have people, in just one role, but it might be a little bit more enjoyable and enable you to retain a greater number of your employees if there is some shared responsibility. In addition, here we want to understand if you've considered the number of directors versus managers versus technicians that you plan to have, because that's ultimately going to affect the hierarchy, the pay structures, but it's also going to require really dictate the level of skill that you need to hire for, and ultimately the trajectory of growth. One thing that I've seen that is I can confidently say is similar in every single facility, no matter what state it is. Your technicians want to be able to graduate to become managers. Your managers want to graduate to become directors. And if there is a true hierarchy in place that gives them that opportunity for growth, you're likely to retain your employees so much longer and have them be far more satisfied in their roles. And ultimately, retaining your employees in cannabis can be difficult, but it doesn't have to be. I see turnover in a lot of facilities be far higher than it needs to be. And there are a lot of ways, like developing a true hierarchy here and giving them metrics to achieve to be able to be promoted and continue to grow. The last thing that I personally want is to have a lot of employee churn because all of the things that we might be doing that is unique to our facility is going to then just leave and go to the next facility and makes the competition a little bit better. So I do my best to keep my employees as happy as I can. As everybody that has ran a business before knows that holding on to an employee is a hell of a lot cheaper than having to go out and source another one. It also just interrupts the operation, is costly. Just want to take a quick second to remind anybody, if you have questions, drop them into the comments and into the chat. I do have somebody monitoring them so that if a question pops up, I'll answer it within that same slide that you actually have asked it, rather than having to hold your questions to the end. Two more questions on this slide regarding hiring, which is, what is your hiring strategy? And I'm really breaking this into two different buckets for your highly skilled people and then for your entry level, more technician level. How are you going to be seeking to fill those roles? Let's talk about the technician levels first. Often people are going to be doing some sort of job fair to be able to bring in a large number of people that are at the entry level. And the only thing to caution there is if you're in a new market, let's say New Jersey right now, where there are more and more cultivation operations coming online, especially in the coming months, you may have a job fair. Your competitor might have a job fair literally next week. And what are you going to do to, persuade those employees or those potential candidates to come and work for you rather than your competitor? You want to probably go through a couple of different rounds of this to be able to fulfill your entire staff, but understanding that it's going to be a little easier to source your entry level folks because you're likely going to be able to pull from people in that local area, relative to the more highly skilled roles that you really want to have an experienced person doing. Let's say you're your director of cultivation, or your IPM manager, your pest manager, they're likely going to be coming from out of state, and you want to give yourself the right length of time with which to fill those roles. In most facilities where I have these high-level employees, I require 30-day notice to be able to move on to another facility because these people are harder to find. And if they're coming from out of state and they need to give 30 days, you can't just decide that, once I get my temporary CO to be able to occupy the building is when I'm going to go try to find and fill these roles. Give yourself at least 4 to 6 months to find that right person. Lastly, how much automation are you planning to rely on in your operation? Just a quick rule of thumb: the greater level of automation, the fewer people you need, but the higher skill level those people need to have. Often in most facilities, I'm seeing a good mixture of the two. What style of benching and tables do you plan to operate? And are you required to use some sort of multi-tiered racking as it relates to real estate costs, or is growing in a single tier an option in your region? I ask this because right now all the trend and all the rage is to go with multi-tier because it's sexier than going single tier. That's what some people think. And unless you're in a state like New Jersey or New York, where real estate costs can be extremely high from a price per square foot, I encourage you to explore whether single tier is an option for you for two main reasons. Number one, from a cost perspective, your capital expenditures for growing multi-tier, to grow 1 square foot of multi-tiered canopy are going to be roughly $60 to $80 a square foot. Relative to growing single tier, you're going to be somewhere between $15 and $20 a square foot in a CapEx setting. So it's 3 to 4x from single tier to multi-tier. Another piece is that when you require your employees to climb different levels, not only do we have safety risks of people falling off of those levels and getting hurt and injured, and the quality of the product from the middle level and the top level, the ones that they can't just see by walking into the facility or walking into the room, the quality often will decrease because inherently it takes a little bit more effort for people to get up to those, so they get checked less frequently, and therefore the quality and the yield will suffer, albeit slightly. If you have a financial model that says every single room is going to be exactly 80 grams a square foot, and you have 3 tiers of racking, I can assure you that 80 grams a square foot is not going to be the exact same on every single level. So you want to make sure that you plan accordingly. Last piece is on a multi-tiered setting. If you are having racks that are taller than 5 foot or taller than 12 foot, the fire suppression requirements as it relates to the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association or agency, they have differing rules and regulations that you have to achieve to be able to get approval by your local fire marshal. And this just adds additional engineering complexity and extra cost on your fire suppression system to achieve those standards versus having a single tier rolling table. I do know, there are pros and cons to multi-tier versus single tier. Just understand why you're making that decision. You hear me picking up the speed a little bit. I'm trying to finish here on that hour and a half that I allotted for you all. If anybody's on lunch break, I'll do my best to tie everything up for you in the next 14 minutes. Have you considered your lighting equipment strategy? This is going to really inform you on the manufacturer or the exact light that you're going to be using. And that will then determine how many lights you need, what your power requirements are, what your cooling requirements are for the HVAC in your room, and also the end product that you're going to create. For years and years, we saw everything was high pressure sodium or HPS lights. Now that LED technology has proven itself, I'm seeing 99% of facilities are being outfitted with LED lights. And with that, we can control spectrum. If you want to be able to control the spectrum, do you want total control over that spectra, or do you want to be able to have preset spectra? Certain lights will be able to create light recipes so that you'll be able to really dial in every single cultivar that you have specific to what it wants. whereas others are going to be preset and just it's going to be this or that. Understand what you're trying to achieve and what your price sensitivity is for that level of equipment. And ultimately, do you want to have UV light? For years, we thought that UV actually created additional cannabinoids. We're seeing more studies and research come out saying that that's not actually true. So I would caution against the UV light, but just make yourself more educated and understanding whether or not you want that supplement to be in your grow. I'll only touch on grow media for a second. Fully explore the pros and cons of each, rock wool versus cocoa, soilless media, aeroponics, living soil. All of them have their pros and cons. Some of them cost more than another. Some are a little bit less environmentally sustainable than the other. And ultimately, what this comes down to is how much buffer or margin of error do you want? I would say that cocoa coir, or I'd say living soil, has the greatest amount of buffer, meaning someone can make a mistake and be able to fix it within a couple of days and then not really notice a tremendous drop off in yield or cannabinoid content. From there, cocoa coir is also has a good buffer. Soilless media roughly in the same. Rock wool has a little bit less of a buffer. And then, aeroponics and deep water culture have a lot less margin for error. And while there are, again, pros and cons of each, understand why you're making that decision. Sometimes, I've heard in certain situations, facilities have gone with rock wool because the main investor didn't want to see dirt in the facility. That's a reason to make that decision. I'm not sure it's the most informed or the one that's really going to execute on that business model as effectively as possible. Have you considered your irrigation strategy? What I mean here is, are you going to hand water? Are you going to use some type of drip irrigation? Is it going to be manually powered where your team actually pushes the button and says go? Is it going to be fully computerized on a timer where there's a little less control but a little bit more automation? Or maybe you're going to take it to that nth degree and have different soil tensiometers throughout your facility that's going to take an aggregate average of what the moisture content is of your media, and that's going to drive when and how much irrigation happens. While that's the most computerized and most advanced, some argue that it's the best for yield and cannabinoid content and to be able to reduce your labor load. Others are staunch opponents of going with hand watering because there's a greater level of quality control. Each individual gets more eyes on the plant. Understand that these decisions here will affect your operational expenses. Hand watering, typically you're going to go through more water and more nutrient, which is going to lead to higher costs on the operational side versus having a fully computerized system that decides when to irrigate. It's going to be higher on the CapEx side. You're going to use less nutrient though, so the operational expenditures will be significantly less than if you hand water. Taking it further, how are you going to design your system, whether it be direct inject, a batch tank system, or manually mixing them? Each again have a level of computerization and automation within them. So your CapEx might be slightly higher on a batch tank system than just manually mixing everything by hand. But often the margin for error in your employees mixing things manually is far less if the computer is doing it through software. Batch tank systems will require a hell of a lot more space in your facility because you have to put those tanks somewhere. Direct inject, meaning that it actually injects the nutrients in line as the water is going to your plants, and it'll run through a series of checks and balances to make sure that it's the right nutrient composition, the right pH, and so forth before it actually hits your plants. That takes up the least amount of space. But some cultivators are uncomfortable with it because it doesn't give them enough control. Understanding, again, there's pros and cons to each. They're all going to affect your labor load. They're all going to affect the style of facility that you're going to ultimately build. And while I'm talking about irrigation, there's a question on the next slide that I'm just going to touch on right now, which is, have you determined the number of cultivars that you're going to grow in an individual room? Because when we're talking about irrigation, you're going to want to design your irrigation system to be able to execute on that. let's just say you're going to have 4 cultivars in the same room, then I strongly encourage you to have 4 zones of irrigation capability in each one of those rooms in the event that each cultivar needs a slightly different mixture. If you've zoned them properly with the right level of infrastructure and the right valves and program that into your software, you can actually execute a different mixture to each one of those zones. Nutrient strategy, what I'll cover here is that I want you to understand that a lot of facilities will use off-the-shelf bottled nutrients, or maybe just off-the-shelf salts that they add to water and then kind of go from there. There's a colleague of mine and I go back and forth about whether it makes sense to measure pennies here. I'm a huge proponent of trying to get our costs as low as we can without sacrificing quality. And if you make the decision that you're going to just say, hey, listen, we're going to go with something that's tried and true, we're going to go with a bottled nutrient that's canna, it's the best, and we're going to go with that. Understand that cost is going to be, call it 10 to 11 times the cost as if you bought aggregate salts and mixed them yourselves in the ratios that your team has determined to be appropriate. Just understand that in order to drive those costs as low as you can, you may want to be able to be, mixing your own salts or mixing your own nutrients if they're organic soils and amendments to really execute on that vision that you have for your end product. All that to be said, there isn't a right way or a wrong way. Know what type of product you're trying to create at the end. Know what level of skill your employees have to be able to do this. And if you're trying to also mix your own nutrients, have a part of your facility that is designed to do so. Pest control. This is one of your most important hires, is to determine who's going to be overseeing your pest management strategy. What I'm referring to here is, most regulations disallow the use of true pesticides. Most consumers do not want to see that your product was treated with pesticide. Speaking in generalities here, but most of the time we'll be using OMRI certified, 25B exempt from the EPA chemicals or formulations that are designed to maybe kill bugs or kill mold and mildew without systemically harming the plant. Understand that a lot of the times we're going to be using beneficial nutrient or beneficial insects. We're actually going to be releasing insects onto our plants. There's a science to this, and this is really going to require a very skilled person to oversee this process. You typically only need one high-level IPM director in your facility, but make sure that you hire somebody that really understands insects, understands different types of pesticides, and ideally has a tremendous amount of experience with which to lean on, potentially from other agricultural industries. This one, just if you're growing indoors, you're growing in a greenhouse, or even if you're growing outdoors, dealing with and mitigating pests is a fact of life. No matter if you are the absolute cleanest facility in the world, there's likely to be a pest outbreak at some point, and having somebody on staff is completely irreplaceable to be able to execute on that. Quick note on light timing. What I mean is, are you going to have all of your lights on at the same time, when your employees are there from, say, 7 to 7 a.m. to p.m., or are you going to stagger your lights? The main reason that you would want to do this is if the power company that you're getting your power from charges your electrical rates based on your peak electrical demand, meaning whatever your highest demand usage is, it takes that, applies it into a formula, and charges you by the kilowatt hour a specific rate based on that peak demand. In states like California and other places that are really stretched on power infrastructure, this is how most of those utilities will bill. And if you're trying to keep your operational costs low, I highly recommend staggering your lights so that maybe half your lights are on between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. The other half are on from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. That's a calculation that you'll have to do for your facility and for your area, because it will really help you on electricity costs. but then it may turn you into a 24/7 facility, which then may make you have to really pay for shift differentials if people are working overnight. So make an informed decision on that, and just understand that that is a major source of cost savings if your facility is of the appropriate scale. PPE strategy, personal protective equipment. This is what I'm really referring to here is make the decision on how much PPE you're going to require and where that's going to be donned or doffed within the facility. Are you going to require people to come in and shower before they put on their work uniform? If so, we have to build a locker room and a facility that is appropriate for that, and understand where that locker room is going to be located within the facility. From an operational perspective, are you going to allow people to go out for lunch? And if so, what's the process and procedure going to be operationally to allow them to leave the facility? And when they come back, are you going to have them shower again? All of this is going to reduce their productivity, though it may reduce your level of contamination and increase your quality control over your products. Ultimately, all of these pieces have to be designed into the operational flow and into the facility design itself. Then you also have to assume the operational expenditures of producing all of this type of equipment. I caution those of you that may be just saying, oh, we're just going to put them in pocketless scrubs because, that's what everybody else is doing. Have somebody, whether it's somebody like me or a food safety person, come in and really inform you on exactly what is the appropriate level of PPE to keep things as clean as possible. Because often having footwear that lives at the facility and having potentially pants that you provide your staff that you also launder, in addition to lab coats, may be actually safer than just having people using scrubs. As it relates to PPE here, I'll just talk about a cleanliness issue. Are you going to allow for cell phones in your facility? Cell phones are usually the dirtiest thing that we come in contact with on a daily basis. And if you're going to allow phone usage in your facility for whatever reason, potentially have a place to have people sanitize their phones before they go into the facility. Just understand that every little piece that you may overlook or every decision that you make will affect the product, the contamination risk, and the overall quality control of your facility. I want to just really give one more piece to this. We have had an unfortunate situation where someone has died in a cannabis cultivation facility in the last year and a half, and we never want to see that happening. And what I strongly encourage everybody to do is walk through their operation and just think through how can we make employees safer? How can we make it easier for them to be safe? And whether that means, directly next to the piece of equipment that might cause a lot of dust, or right next to the atomizer that you use for foliar sprays, having the right respirators that have been appropriately fit tested for that specific employee that literally has their name on it, having that located exactly next to the piece of equipment that they would need to use and don that mask before they use that equipment. Keep it as easy as possible for the folks and keep that, have space allocated for all of this equipment and for this protective gear to make it as easy as possible for them so that the operational flow can continue and people's safety is prioritized. It will lead to happier employees, people that feel like you're really taking care of them, which then will lead to a greater employee retention. And ultimately, if we have everything designed in flow, we will have as productive of it as an employee as possible, which will lead to the greatest amount of revenue and ultimately the greatest level of profitability. This is my last slide here, and I've already touched on one of the questions, so we got two left. What type of cultivars do you plan to grow, and what is your cultivar release strategy? Ironically, this is the last question that I'm going to ask here, and often it is the first question that I hear answered when I start asking people, what is their strategy for this or that? Oh, don't worry about it. I've got this master grower in California. They've been growing on the hill for 27 years. They've got all the best genetics. Great. What about the other 95 questions that we've asked to be able to design this operation to execute on your business model? Understanding that your genetics are huge. They do play a pivotal role. I'm not here to downplay that, but I like to choose cultivars that are effective for the operation that I've designed and not vice versa. Understanding that if you're trying to really set yourself apart by the genetic variety that you choose, you can do that by having any level of combination of the genetics that I'm suggesting here. The tried and true, like the Acapulco Gold and the Panama Red from the 60s and 70s, or the Blue Dreams and White Widows from the 90s, or the hype strains that we've seen in the last couple of years come out, like the Runts or Blueberry Muffin or Slurricane, etc. All of these will help you differentiate yourself from the competition. They may not fit the operational plan that you've designed up until this point. And really, your business model should really determine what cultivars you go with. If you're trying to be the top shelf producer that grows as much flower as possible and is as profitable as possible, that's going to lend itself to a certain selection of genetics. If you're trying to instead be the brand that wins the greatest number of cannabis cups and just gets the most press in high times and the media outlets, that's going to lend itself to a different genetic selection. And it's also going to lend itself to a different operational design. When we come back to your cultivar release strategy, really what I'm trying to detail here is, are you planning to run the same 5 or 10 cultivars forever? What happens when the market starts to get tired of those? How often are you going to rotate them? Are you going to rotate them constantly, which has the pro that you're always releasing something new and it's always effective for your end customer, whether that be the dispensary or the consumer themselves. But then the con is that you don't get to utilize the data from growing that cultivar for 10 or 12 harvests to really perfect the strategy to grow it. What I prefer is having a standard number of strains that are producing for you, so that you can maintain that level of revenue that you're trying to achieve, where you have your tried and true that you can rely upon that are stable, but then also having a new cultivar drop with some regularity so that you can continue to release new products to your consumers, both on the retail level and at your end consumer. If your brand is dropping a new cultivar, like my standard, if I have the facility to do so, I'll drop a new cultivar every 2 weeks. And that just gets designed into the production calendar, which then gets designed into the operation and into the facility itself. And we always have something new. And if you're going to be doing that, know that and make that decision ahead of time so that you can inform your director of cultivation and they can really make sure that they've built that into their planning process. Just understand that you're unlikely to be able to just choose 5 or 10 cultivars and run them forever. It's also often ineffective to constantly be rotating everything forever, just because of the level of complexity that it entails. And so ultimately, I'm going to wrap up with just one more thing and just verify that no questions came in. But ultimately, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, please take away this. If you're a new operator, your best path forward is to design your business model and business plan in conjunction with your operational design, so that you can then design your facility from there. So that we can make sure that business plan is executable through the operational design, and then have the facility reflect upon that. If you're an existing operator and you notice that things are going less than perfectly in the ideal world that we've just kind of talked about, go through and pretend like you don't have an operation that is running right now, and try to determine what changes you would make and exactly how you would then design your operation, and slowly but systematically start at the beginning and start redesigning it and retrofitting things so that you can make it as efficient and as cost effective as possible. Because if you're in a state, let's say Missouri right now, where their price per pound is still pretty fat, and operators are making quite a bit of profit, The time to redesign and retrofit your operation is today, to get it so that your operational costs are as low as possible, so that when price compression happens in the near or distant future, you're already set up. If you wait too long and price compression sets in and you can only get $900 per pound for your product and it costs you $850 per pound to produce that product, you're kind of stuck at that point because you can't generate the revenue and the margin to be able to reinvest in your operation. So the time to do that is now. And if you're an industry professional that's trying to steer your client to the right way to do this, I strongly encourage you to have them get an operator, an experienced operator involved as early in the process as possible. Ideally, right after they've hired you and they haven't spent any real money on the operation in themselves. They haven't even hired an architect or a general contractor yet. Get an operator involved as early as possible in the process so that a lot of these questions can be considered and the business will be set up for the greatest likelihood of profitability long term. Right here, I had promised at the beginning, there's a QR code. If you're on a desktop, you can whip out your cell phone right now and scan that QR code. It'll take you to my website I'll have all of these slides available to you. If you're on your phone, take a screenshot and scan it later, or just take a screenshot and just shoot me a message. Any way that you see on the bottom right there, whether it's email, send me a text message through a cell phone, or reach out to me on LinkedIn or on my website, fill out the contact form. Just reach out and say, hey, I would like to get a copy of those slides. I'd be happy to provide them. And if you enjoyed this presentation and felt like somebody that you know or are connected to, whether it be a client, a friend, a family member, would benefit from this presentation will be shown in its entirety on my LinkedIn page. We'll also rebroadcast it onto my website and to YouTube. And ultimately, we'll eventually be splitting it up so that if there's just one specific question that you think somebody could really benefit from, stay tuned to my LinkedIn and my resource lab on my website, because we'll be chopping this up to really make it as maximally shareable as possible. With that, I'll look to see if we have any questions. Did any questions come in? No? Okay. Appreciate everybody's time and attention. Look forward to if anybody on this video here is going to be going to MJ Biz in the next couple of weeks, and you see me, stop me, say hello, introduce yourself. I'd love to meet you. Thanks for your attention, and look forward to next time.